get some tea. Good.
Gdzie siadaj? Że? A ty chodź. Tak, to jest jasne, to jest napisane.
Thank you. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Ukrainian Association, I welcome you all to the Midland one-day Keston College conference, and I hope that it will be a successful one. Let me first of all invite the chairman of the Keston College branch, Nottingham, Canon Michael Jackson, Mr. Chairman.
Ladies and gentlemen, my duty is a very short one. It's a great pleasure to invite the Lord Mayor of Nottingham to give us a civic welcome to our regional conference. My Lord Mayor.
Kevin Jackson, my lady parents, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Kevin Jackson, and your colleagues at the Keston College support group for inviting the Lady Mayoress and myself to be joining you this morning and in giving me the pleasure of saying a few words of civic welcome to you all today. In doing so, I express my thanks to those who have been involved in organising the Midland Regional Day Conference, and I hope you have a successful gathering. I'm sure that you're looking forward to what the speaker has to say at the conference session this morning, and which I'm sure will create much lively discussion. I would like to wish your organisation continued encouragement and success in its aims and objectives of monitoring and gathering information about the position of believers of all faiths in communist countries. I appreciate that your gatherings and meetings, not only your support group, but also at conferences like this, provide you with much welcomed opportunity of meeting and sharing your views and opinions. And in Nottingham in particular, there is a lively support group under the chairmanship of Kevin Jackson. Once again, may I express my thanks to the Nottingham Ukrainian Society for hosting the conference. As you know, it is an important year for them in celebrating their 1,000 years of Christianity in the Ukraine. And I'm sure you're all looking forward to the Ukrainian concert this evening. We all appreciate the very superb quality of their musicians, dancers and so on. Colonel Jackson, once again, may I say what a pleasure it is to welcome you all to Nottingham. It's indeed one of the highlights of our civic year to see such groups gathered in our city. Thank you very much.
Nottingham support group to see such a large company attending this regional conference, and we're delighted that our friends, the Ukrainian Cultural Association, are acting as hosts for this event. And what an interesting and valuable one it is. And we're delighted to that Reverend Michael Butler, the General Director of Keston, is able to come along with Jane Ellis to give us the latest picture on the scene in the Soviet world, but especially to anchor it to the great celebration for the millennium of Christianity, with its roots deep in Ukraine and in Ukrainian culture. Fortunately, little introduction is needed for our speaker, and it's my duty to give way to him now and to invite Michael Butler to speak to us.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Nottingham after an absence of about 18 months. I didn't expect that this morning I would almost kill the mayor in presenting him with a book. Back there I slipped down the steps and we almost ended up in a pile on the floor. But the book that I was presenting to him did have Ukrainian significance. It was called Be Our Voice, and it is the story of the establishment of Keston College, how it grew from nothing to its present size as a research institute with about 30 people at it. The title of the book, Be Our Voice, comes from an encounter that I had with two Ukrainian ladies in 1964 in Moscow. They had come all the way to Moscow from Pachayev in western Ukraine, as I had come to Moscow from Britain. And we come for similar complementary purposes. They had come to inform anybody they could find about the desperate situation of their own church, the threats of the closure of their monastery at Pachayev. I had come to Moscow to gather information, and by an amazing coincidence, the story of which is told in that book, we met on a street in Moscow, and in exchanging information, I said to them, "Is there any request you have of me?" And the phrase that they used in reply is one which I have never forgotten. And they said, "Yes, we need your help. Be our voice and speak for us." That phrase, so simple, contains within itself the whole basis of the work and development of Keston College. Coming from Ukraine via Moscow, it nevertheless encapsulates a call from believers in all parts of the communist world. The persecuted church in general speaks with that voice and in that phrase. And it is a response to that which has seen the development of our work over the past 20 years. Next year we shall celebrate our 20th anniversary. But in those days, the religious communities in the communist countries felt themselves very much in isolation. They did not have a voice which could easily speak to the world. That does not mean it was correct then to describe them, as sometimes people did, as the Church of Silence. They did not want to be silent, but they did not have means of communication. And over the last 20 years, we have seen a remarkable growth in the determination to and the ability to communicate from believers of the East to believers of the West. And when I began this work, I myself felt totally isolated. I did not have colleagues. I was almost entirely on my own during most of the 1960s. But from that isolation, in this 20-year period, we have grown into a community. I do not mean simply the group of colleagues that I have at the college itself, but a true community of interest, of support for, of prayer for the persecuted church by the church in many parts of the world, which we sometimes talk of as the free world. The obligation to know about and to sympathize with the persecuted church is something which has grown immeasurably during that period of time. And as we come up to celebrating our 20th anniversary at Keston College, not such an important anniversary as we are celebrating here today, which I shall come on to in a few moments' time, but we have, during this past week, been moving into the new block which has just been completed at Keston College, and it more than doubles our accommodation. And any unpreparedness that you may notice in my lecture would simply be due to the fact that we have been extremely busy physically moving rooms during the course of the week. And I myself got back from a 10-day trip to America only last weekend, so it has been an extremely difficult week. But Roland Bryan and Jane Ellis and myself are delighted to be here and to be able to share this great occasion marking the millennium of Ukrainian and Russian Christianity with you this morning. During the course of the week, one thing which I managed to do was to go to a lecture in London a couple of days ago by President Carter's former security advisor, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski. I assure you my Ukrainian pronunciation is a little better than my Polish. Dr. Brzezinski put forward a thesis which intrigued me. It wasn't exactly new, but it is not one that is popular to assert in political circles, and it was a political lecture. It was not to do with religion at all. Religion was barely mentioned in it. But his intriguing thesis was basically this, that the seeds of destruction within the Soviet Empire are now so evident, indeed to many people living under communist domination, so self-evident, that the future of that Soviet Empire is clearly limited. He said that it is most unlikely in the present circumstances that there would be a widespread return to terror, the kind of terror that some of us knew under Stalin. People in this room experienced that, and I first knew the Soviet Union when Stalin had only been dead for 6 years. Professor Brzezinski foresaw in his lecture, and this is an unpopular thesis with our politicians because they basically like dealing with the status quo, and not even a conservative government so sympathetic to much of the new thinking which is going on in Eastern Europe. Not even the conservative government talks actively about breakup of the Soviet Empire. Talk to some of our senior politicians, and it's not easy for them to take that concept on board. But Mr. Brzezinski, who was security advisor to President Carter, and therefore one of the most influential figures in the United States for a number of years, and still carries a great deal of clout, says that the Soviet Empire is unlikely to be with us that much longer. He didn't place a term on it. But what he said was that we are in the middle of a process within which Eastern Europe, not the Soviet Union, but Eastern Europe, the rest of it, is turning back towards Western Europe, but reasserting its cultural and national identity as being part of Central Europe. A Central Europe made up of nation states which reflect their own particular cultures and political traditions. This vision has been gaining clarity and momentum in recent years among European intellectuals of all kinds in the East. But it's significant that now these ideas too are being put forward by such people as Professor Brzezinski. He spoke optimistically of a spring of nations, similar in scope and force to what occurred in 1848, and which is now taking place in the region which we broadly call Eastern Europe. He singled out Hungary and especially Poland and 3 other nations as countries ripe for revolution, anti-Soviet, anti-communist revolution. He says that the national opposition movements have gone so far that the process of their establishment is now irreversible. And what is the mark of that Soviet empire, according to Brzezinski, which is different from the British Empire? There is not one captive nation which respects the dominant political partner. There is not one nation, either within the Soviet Union or outside it in the rest of Eastern Europe, which looks to Moscow with any kind of admiration for its political system, for its cultural institutions. Whereas with the British Empire, many parts of the empire did do that. And even so, the British Empire dissolved, just like that, in a period of some 20 years following World War II. Nor is the Soviet model the economic driving force which it would need to be to keep such an empire in place. And I suppose that is the understatement of 1988. And I can see the shadowy figure of Mr. Gorbachev nodding back in the room there. There is only one force which keeps the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe together, and that is military might. Now that was Mr. Brzezinski's thesis in outline, brilliantly delivered lecture, and carried a great deal of conviction. But I had a question of him at the end, and I was surprised that he had not paid more attention to the internal Soviet empire. And I said to him, how can it be that the world still, if the Soviet empire is breaking up, pays so little attention to the world's greatest nation, which does not even have nominal independence, i.e. Ukraine? Mr. Brzezinski's answer I wasn't completely satisfied with. He said that we need to go softly in our dealings with Ukraine and the internal empire, while pushing for democratic development in the rest of Eastern Europe. I was not completely convinced by that thesis. I think he underestimated the potential of Ukraine as being an internal factor for for moving towards the end of Soviet power. In other words, the growing dissatisfaction of Ukrainian people with the present setup, a nation of some 40 million people, one of the largest nations of Europe, that internal dissatisfaction is a potent political force in the Soviet Union today. That is my view. It is certainly a growing one, and I believe that in the year of the millennium, it will be due to grow even more. Because I see this great event, 1,000 years of the establishment of Christianity, as being something which will even further identify the Christian presence in the Soviet Union, the forces moving away from the center, the need and the growing determination of the non-Russian Soviet nations to move towards their self-identity. Of course, this to some extent applies to Russia as well, but Jane Ennis will be talking about things of more Russian significance later. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic is not a particularly, looking at the words, not a particularly beautiful phrase. Neither is it, I think, a particularly accurate phrase. For a start, as we all know, the Soviets have been trying to Russianize cultural institutions in Ukraine, and whether it is Soviet or not is certainly open to question. It is superficially, but I would doubt whether beneath the surface there is very much really in the hearts of people in the Republic of Ukraine, which is specifically Soviet. Socialist is certainly not, and I don't need to argue the point, and Republic it does not even begin to be except in name. But the unfortunate fact is, of course, that Soviet domination over the last 40 years in Ukraine has meant that to the world at large, Ukrainian identity has been, to some extent, hidden. And there are still far too many people around who ought to know better, who refer to Russia when they mean Ukraine. They can refer to Russia when they mean Georgia and Armenia or Lithuania and Latvia. But the size and the importance of one of the largest nations in Europe is certainly not sufficiently identified in the cultural and political map of Europe at the moment. And I, as I said a moment ago, felt that Professor Brzezinski, to some extent, was guilty of misemphasis at that point. There are so many aspects of Soviet propaganda which have been successful in recent years. When I lived in the Soviet Union as a student in 1959, I was so horrified by the barrage of propaganda which came across to me that I felt that this kind of propaganda was bound to be unsuccessful. But over the last 30 years of my working life, I've been amazed and on many occasions dispirited to see just how effective Soviet propaganda can be, and in dimming the importance of Ukraine in the eyes of the world, Soviet propaganda has achieved one of its most notable coups. I mean, for example, one of the statements always made when Christians meet together and there are peace conferences, which happen with great frequency, involving churchmen of East and West, the Soviet delegation will always say something along the lines of, we of course in Russia or in the Soviet Union are for peace. We have to be for peace because of our 20 million war dead. How many, any country which has lost as many people as that will inevitably strive for peace. And then a more or less straight Soviet government propaganda line will come across. It's amazing how much of that propaganda line is accepted unquestioningly by church people in international conferences. And that phrase, 20 million Russian war dead is one that I've heard innumerable times, and it is simply not accurate. For a start, whether they were 20 million or not, they were a very large number, but they were not all war dead, in the sense that, well, how do you classify the million or so people, soldiers who were captured by the Germans and were repatriated at the end of the war and then disappeared into the Soviet Gulag as traitors, so-called, and never emerged from the Gulag? They're in that figure of 20 million, but can you, in any accurate sense, call them war dead? And then it is believed these were 20 million Russians. Well, as I'm sure everybody in this room is only too well aware, probably more than 50%, I don't have accurate figures, but the way the war waged across Ukraine, probably more than 50% were Ukrainians and not Russians at all. All this needs unpacking. I'm simply talking from my own personal point of view about how effective Soviet propaganda has been and how difficult it is for me in my job to get people to look accurately at the map of the Soviet-dominated part of Europe at the present moment. It is a time, I think, for new perceptions, and that is why I'm so excited by this millennium. If we have any chance to improve people's perceptions, that chance should come this year. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, also celebrating its millennium this year, will be very greatly in the news on many occasions. It's already started. The Times has had a good article just before Christmas about the millennium. My own article on the subject was published in the Church Times yesterday. I'm not sure that I'm wildly keen on the title, which is the Church Times editor's own title. It's called A Soviet Millennium. I am actually hoping that in 1,930 years' time, that in 930 years' time, there will not be a Soviet millennium to celebrate. But nevertheless, it does say 1,000 years of Christianity, and the article, I hope, is better than the title. And it does hold in balance the fact that this is the millennium both of Russia and of the Ukrainian church at the same time. A leading spokesman for the world's largest underground church, which is in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Yosif Terelia, his name is well known to all of us, said this a few years ago while he was still in the Soviet Union. I want Ukraine to be a free and cultured country, not dependent on anyone. I want her to take her rightful place of honor among the cultured nations of the world. And for the future, I want us to find unification and freedom only in the love of Jesus Christ. I think those are remarkable, outgoing, ecumenical words, which are an ideal prelude to this great year of the millennium. And it indeed is a matter of pride and honor for me that I'm able to perhaps start off my own millennium year in this way by speaking here today. And I want to spend the rest of my time, because this has been a rather more political introduction than I'm used to giving, but these thoughts were in my mind. I want to spend the rest of my time talking about the place of the Ukrainian church in the world today. That is the subject of my lecture as announced. And to give a Christian view of that. Whose Christian view? Well, mine. This is a very personal reflection. Josip Terelia thus points out the connection between two major themes in the history of Ukraine: the striving for recognition as an equal among nations, and the tradition of Christianity. Well, what's the connection between the two? I think it's this, that today the special role of Christians in Ukraine does offer to the world lessons which it can ill afford to ignore. The Ukraine can play, and I believe indeed will play, a special role in the world of the immediate future by serving as a teacher, a guide, and an example. There is no country of the world where the ideal of the suffering church, so close to the New Testament reality of the suffering church, is demonstrated than in today's Ukraine. My views on this at slightly greater length than I'm able to pass on to you this morning will be found in this book published last year, 10 Dying Soviet Churches After 70 Years of Soviet Communism. It is magnificent but also honest to be able to publish a book called 10 Growing Soviet Churches. The persecution and the appalling experiences of so many people in Ukraine, recounted, for example, in Robert Conquest's book Harvests of Sorrow last year, those experiences, far from eliminating the Christian faith, unfortunately Robert Conquest doesn't say much about that in his book, have actually led to a strengthening of the faith. And it's my profound belief that the Christian faith generally of the Soviet Union is now more strong in its basis than it has been at any time over the last 100 years. I say 100 years because there was a turning away from the faith, certainly by intellectuals and so on, before the revolution, and then the persecutions under Lenin and Stalin. And it's only now that things have begun to change. But they are changing, and they are changing profoundly. And we have a whole chapter in this book on Ukraine, on the Catholic Church of the Western Ukraine, and a second chapter on Ukrainian evangelicals, Ukrainian Baptists, describing their activities in the city of Arkhів. So may I be immodest enough to commend that book for further reading for anybody who would like more on the subject. The book doesn't actually say very much about the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, in fact nothing at all, but Jane Ellis's book there on the table does, and I'm sure she will mention that in her lecture later on this morning. So what are these lessons that the Church in Ukraine has to teach us? And I refer specifically to the Ukrainian Catholic Church. First has to do with the relationship between the Church and society. Historically, the Ukrainian Catholic Church has been a church of the people rather than a church of the state. Under Polish and then Soviet, then Austrian and then Soviet rule, it's always shared people's aspirations for the dignity and independence of the individual and of the nation. It has formulated the Christian basis and guiding principles for those aspirations. So it does today. The underground Catholic Church in the Soviet Union continues its tradition of Christian activism. Josip Terelia, a few years ago, wrote a letter to West German Catholics in which he indicated the role of the Church and its responsibility in today's world. I quote, "The thorny path now trodden by the Ukrainian Catholic Church leads our people towards love, towards the purpose of Christianity throughout the world, the kingdom of God. International rivalry and strife should disappear in the way of unity shown in the new commands of Jesus Christ. We, Catholic Christians, cannot be passive observers of the destruction of the world. And in a letter to President Reagan, which appeared in the 4th issue of the clandestine chronicle of the Catholic Church in Ukraine, the same author asks, can a Christian stand apart from the events which are taking place in today's world? When the fate of humanity is being decided, can we Christians fail to participate in the general discussion? Would this not testify to our indifference to social good? Jesus Christ taught us an active life among the wolves of this world. Vasil Koprin, who like Terrelia suffered years of imprisonment for his beliefs, expresses a similar thought in his letter to Austrian Catholics, also published in Chronicle number 6. Jesus said, "Go among the wolves of the world," which means that not only must we pray, but we must also take an active part in life and strive for the limits of our power to create good and sow the seeds of love among the evil of this crippled world. What was this active role that the Church must play in the life of the people? In his Easter talk, in the 4th issue of the Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Ukraine, Josip Terrelia draws an analogy between today's Ukraine and the Poland of the 19th century. When a nation falls into captivity, he says, it begins to seek spiritual renewal and moral regeneration. It looks for ethical guides. Today, he concludes, it's the Church which can serve as such a guide for the captive Ukrainian people. There's an analogy with present-day Poland as well, for it's there that the world has seen, and this has been acknowledged in the world's press in a way that Ukraine very, very rarely features on the pages of anybody's newspapers. But Poland, as we all know, has been front-page news, and rightly so, many times in recent years. And it's in Poland that the world has been shown how the Church can act as a powerful focus for the aspirations not only of individuals, not only of workers, and amazing that was to our de-Christianized society in this country, but focus of the aspiration of the whole Polish nation there in the Church. This is true also of Lithuania, another subject to which both Keston College and I have paid a great deal of attention in the past and in the present. In the Third World, too, we've seen the role of the Church expanding in certain countries, but there is a controversy in our world today as to what the role of the Church vis-à-vis the state in the modern world should be. And is it not true that in the Third World, the debate about liberation theology has reminded us how easy it is to lose sight of Christian principles in the zealous pursuit of social activism? The issue of the Church's role in society is a matter of debate here in this country. Should the Church be a commentator, a guide, or a leader? Should the Church be separate from the state? And if so, how far does that limit the Church's role in public life? In all these debates, the Ukrainian Church, with its rich historical experience, its tradition as a leader of the nation, and, perhaps most importantly, the continuing Christian witness of the faithful in Ukraine under persecution, can serve as a guide and as an example. The attempt to re-establish the official existence of the Catholic Church in Ukraine has been spearheaded in recent years by the Action Group for the Defense of Believers and the Church, an organization dedicated simply to the legalization of the Ukrainian Church following its abolition over 40 years ago. And despite the emigration of Josip Terrelia last year, I haven't met him yet, but many personal messages have been passed along the line. he founded that group and was its guiding member, and despite his emigration, that movement continues for the legalization of the Ukrainian church. And this issue of legalization brings us to an important point in our discussion of the relationship between church and state. In the West, when we are talking about church and state, we usually envisage a situation where the state is either neutral or positive towards the church. In America, there is separation of church and state, complete separation. But certainly, the administration, political administration in Washington is positive towards religion. It is only in the Soviet Union that we've seen a phenomenon unique in human history to the 20th century, and indeed to the communist world of the 20th century. A state which is hostile to all forms of religion, but not only that, it expressly sets out ultimately to eradicate religion. And the justification of our work at Keston College in concentrating on the communist world is precisely this, that there is no other political system which has ever been devised in history which does seek the eradication of religion. There have been plenty of political systems where one religion has persecuted another, and there are plenty of those today which are not part of our study, and we're quite often asked, why are we not working, for example, for liberty of Christians who live under Islamic regimes? But the setup of the political philosophy in such states is so totally different from the phenomenon that I'm talking about in communist Europe, communist Eastern Europe, that really there are no points of similarity. Because the philosophy of state towards religion in the communist countries is so entirely unique, that provides our justification for undertaking the study that we do. As Marxist governments multiply in places like Ethiopia, Nicaragua, Angola, Mozambique, and other countries, perhaps our traditional Western notions of church-state relations may be inadequate to understand the processes which are taking place in those countries. And it is absolutely true to say that not only does the Soviet Union export revolution, it exports atheism. There is not a single country of the world which has moved left towards Marxism, which has not at the same time involved itself in some kind of active hostility towards the church. Of course, the degree of that hostility varies from country to country. And perhaps you could not use the phrase active religious persecution of all those countries. But certainly, atheism remains at the heart of Marxist practice as well as theory. It is therefore important for us to understand, for the world to understand, what are the bases of Soviet atheism, and especially the legal bases. Obviously, philosophical questions are one thing, but what is written into the law restricting religious life is something beyond that and quite different from it. There are churches in the Soviet Union, as we all know, which are legal, and there are other churches which are illegal. But law, in the Soviet understanding of the term, is a tool of politics. Legalization, the question of legalization of the Ukrainian church is very important here. Legalization is, in the view of the Kremlin, seen as a means to control, manipulate, and ultimately subvert a church. The experience of the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church in the 1920s was an example of that. And therefore, this explains the skepticism of many Ukrainian Catholics towards Soviet-style legislation, legalization, it is not quite the answer to say, if we are able to re-legalize the Ukrainian Catholic Church, all problems will be at an end. If you asked a Ukrainian Baptist that same question, the answer that many of them would give is likely to be negative. There are, of course, many Ukrainian Baptists who worship in registered, therefore legal communities, but there are many others who do not, and indeed would not wish to, as my chapter on Hartford in that book illustrates. Such has been the control through the law, through legalization of religion by the Soviet state, that there is widespread skepticism in the Soviet Union at the moment as to whether the present system can be properly reformed at all. Josip Terelia once said to a Soviet official when he was being interrogated, "I do want legalization of my church, but not the kind that you are offering." For under a regime that's hostile to religion, the notion of legalization is not a substitute for religious liberty. Indeed, it can imply the opposite. And this is a concept which so far it has proved totally impossible for Western church leaders, by and large, to assimilate. You will get waves and waves and waves of Christian leaders going into the Soviet Union and seeing open churches in Moscow full of worshippers, or in Kiev for that matter, and they come back and they say, we saw the churches, they were full, and therefore what is being said about the persecution of the church in the Soviet Union is to some extent a creation of Western propaganda. And one hears that phrase from highly responsible people. And part of the work of Keston College is to inform and illuminate and to tell the world that indeed open churches for worship in Moscow, Kiev and Leningrad are part of the picture. A proper part of the picture, not a sham. But the persecuted church in Ukraine, where there is not one single Ukrainian Catholic church officially open in the whole country, that is also a part of the picture. And the two have to be held together in balance. That is something which Keston College is trying to teach the world, and which we find it very tough going to do. And then, of course, there are people who come back from the Soviet Union after these rather impressive visits, and I've been on some of them myself, and then they say, persecution, well, that was under Stalin, wasn't it? There are some who are persecuted today. Yes, we know that there are Christians in prison, but to a certain extent they bring that persecution upon themselves because they refuse to go along with the state laws. They reject the system. They should obey the law. My heart turns over when really a revulsion when I hear such a statement, because that is straight communist propaganda. But it has been repeated by churchmen and churchwomen, for that matter, time and time again, responsible people. They should obey the law. And one wonders whether, if that same person who's made that statement, a Western church leader, was told, right, from now on, your children have no right whatsoever to learn about the Christian faith. From now on, your only practical involvement in the Christian faith will be to go to church on Sunday, and your minister's fraternal or your church meeting coming up next week is to be banned. Whether they would accept that because some of the state had decreed it is highly dubious. Law has been in the news, and there is a question. Will the Soviet laws on religion be changed? contradictory signals on this, as on most other things, are coming out of the Soviet Union. And I am one who believes about Mr. Gorbachev, A, that he is sincere, and he probably, he certainly does want to achieve changes. He sincerely wants those changes, that's what I mean. But his position is extremely fragile. It could change at any moment. There is massive opposition within the Communist Party to what he's doing. And it is also unclear what the long-term goal will be. It's quite possible that with his economic reforms, the long-term goal is to have a stronger, a more powerful Soviet Union by the turn of the year 2000. I'm sure that is what he's aiming for. But the question along the way is the means to achieve this. And among the favourable signs which have been coming out of the Soviet Union, I won't go into all the questions of the church and glasnost, that's another lecture that I can give, but it's not today's. The question inevitably arises, is the church getting a better deal under Gorbachev and in the past? It's intriguing to think that under Stalin, during his last years, there were actually more than double the number of churches open in the Soviet Union than there are now. That is quite a thought. More than double the churches open in the Soviet Union in the late 40s and early 50s than there are in today's Soviet Union. Only last year, or the year before last, did the number of theological students of the Russian Orthodox Church surpass the number that there were in the Soviet Union when Stalin died. Khrushchev closed down 7 of the 10 theologicals, 5 of the 8 theological seminaries. And the numbers were so reduced that theological education was under grave threat as to whether it would continue at all in the 1960s. But gradually, the 3 theological seminaries which remained open have expanded their numbers, and they're now more or less back, or they're just a bit better than back, to where they were in the 1950s. But it really is a thought which people find it very difficult to assimilate, that in many respects the church was better off under Stalin than it was even in the 1970s during the period of so-called détente. So is there going to be a change in the Soviet law on religion? If there were a complete change, every town and village in the Soviet Union would open its church if one exists, or would build one, or use a private home for that purpose. There would be not tens but hundreds of thousands. In pre-revolutionary Russia, there were about 60,000 Orthodox churches alone. So in today's Soviet Union, I would guess that the number of churches would go right up to 200,000, talking about all denominations, without any problem at all. So we would see a growth factor of maybe 100 times over the present number of churches. And the small number of churches is ensured by control of the Soviet law, the enforcement of registration. No religious community can exist without an active license given to it from the Soviet state. And because license has not been given, then the number of churches is impossibly small. So will that law be reformed and more churches able to exist, possibly without registration at all? I was on I was at a conference in California last week, and a Soviet delegation, Russian Orthodox Church, turned up, and they were very friendly, and they spoke something I thought would never happen. I heard one of the delegation get up and in public and with press present, he actually said, как сказал Michael Bordeaux, я совершенно согласен с ним. As Michael Bordeaux said, and I'm completely in agreement with him, just as if it was all in the day's work. and actually such a statement has never before come out of the Moscow Patriarchate, but they were extremely friendly, extremely warm. The leader of that delegation said, we are not going to have a revision of the Soviet laws on religion this year. Maybe next year, not this year. And yet, Ізвестія, just 3 or 4 days after that, published an article saying there is going to be a reform of Soviet law. Konstantin Karchev, the minister, the head of the Council on Religious Affairs, the state body, said that the church is going to be given clear legal rights to open new churches, to recover traditional church property. That's sort of sticking point number 1. Sticking point number 2, which has been cause of many people's imprisonment, the rights of parents to arrange private religious tuition for their children will be respected. Now, if that happens, it will be a major, massive change. I must say that in Glasnost, let me just, you all know what Glasnost means, but it's misused in the press. It actually means publicity rather than change. And the word for change is perestroika. And in my view, there has been much more publicity than perestroika. Perestroika is hardly starting yet. And as far as the churches are concerned, very, very little has happened. Promises, promises, promises in abundance. But on the ground, on those collective farms, I doubt whether life has changed very much yet. Will it? Well, we don't know, but there's every reason why we should be informed and pray and press in every possible way for change. If there were such a major change in the law, it would obviously have a very great effect on Christian life in the Soviet Union. But even in such an outgoing and perhaps forward-looking article as that in Ізвестія, one key question which concerns us was not mentioned. Will church in Ukraine be legalized? Well, that, at the moment, is very much of an open question. Let me turn away from that and mention for a few moments ecumenical dialogue, and with this I will finish. Because it's another lesson we can learn from the church in Ukraine. We've had something about lessons from suffering, something about church-state relations. Ecumenism. In our world, there are official groups, official organizations which deal with unity of the churches. And my personal experience is that I've learned much more about real Christian unity coming out of the persecuted church than I have out of the official ecumenical organizations in our world of today. It's a kind of buzzword, ecumenism. And the lesson coming from what was probably one of the most traditionally Catholic areas of the world, the Western Ukraine, is nevertheless quite remarkable. The Christian leaders in the West have rightly sought a Christian solution to the East-West conflict, and that's brought them to the doorstep of the Russian Orthodox hierarchy, a hierarchy which, as I've illustrated, is tragically in the grips of a virulently atheistic regime. As we all know only too well, the Moscow Patriarchate has been forced to support a Soviet foreign policy which is contrary to Christian principles. 40 years ago, it was also, the Moscow Patriarchate was forced to participate in the brutal destruction of a sister church, the liquidation of the church in Ukraine. I suppose that is the most anti-ecumenical gesture of which any church has been guilty in the 20th century. And yet it is the Moscow Patriarchate which is the focus of ecumenical gestures by the churches of the West. But there's another kind of ecumenism at work in the USSR which I find much more satisfactory. And it's an ecumenism which the authors of the Chronicle of the Catholic Church in Ukraine, unofficial publication, referred to on a number of occasions. They document it, and I would have read you some of that, but I think I will go ahead, as time is running out, and simply substitute a few words spoken by Josip Terrelia in his very first press conference in the West, just before Christmas. And one of our colleagues from Keston College, Andrew Sorokovsky, went over for that press conference. And what Terrelia said was this: the Ukrainian Catholic Church has close contacts with almost all religious groups on the territory of Ukraine, Moldavia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and also Russia. We have fairly close relations with the true Orthodox Church. That's another illegal group. We maintain contacts with the Tikhonites, that's the underground Russian Orthodox Church. We maintain close relations with the Lithuanian Catholic Church, the most brotherly and the closest, most familiar church to us. But we also maintain contacts with Pentecostals, evangelical Christians, the Initiative Niki Baptists, the unregistered